You are listening to the Wealth Formula Podcast with Buck Joffrey. Get ready to change your life.
Welcome, everybody. This is Buck Joffrey with the Wealth Formula Podcast. I want to remind you that there is a website here with Wealth Formula Podcast called wealthformula.com where you can get all sorts of resources at your fingertips, including my best-selling book, 7 Secrets of Eternal Wealth, which you can also get by simply texting 44222 and typing in Wealth Formula, one word. Now, I also want to point out that there's an event coming up, which I know that many of you would really benefit from, and there's a few spots left. It's our next Wealth Formula meetup in Dallas, Texas, September 27th and 28th. It is a meetup that will include lectures from very smart people, including Tom Wheelwright, Doug Lodmell, and Dave Steele. We're also going to do a bus tour of the Dallas real estate multifamily market. And then we're going to have cocktails the night before, the cocktails the night after. And probably the biggest thing is just getting to know one another, because this is a tremendous community. Those of you who came to the event last spring, I should say, are aware of this. In Scottsdale, it was a really, really good time, and people really enjoyed it. So check it out, wealthformulaevents.com, and hopefully you can make it out there. I want to move forward with today's show. It's a little bit more serious in nature. You see, I was in Minneapolis a couple weeks ago, visiting my parents with my family. We go there once a year. I take my little girls out there, and they see grandma and grandpa, and they hang out in the house, and we hang out, we stay in their basement. It's always kind of a nice little tradition we have. We were so we had a good trip, and everything was fine until the night before, and I was sitting in a recliner talking to my parents, and decided to call it a night. And I got up out of this recliner, and suddenly something seemed very, very wrong. It was like I felt like I was in a dream. Like I could not keep a thought, and my whole body started to feel very heavy. And I made it down the stairs. And I saw my wife getting ready for bed, so I went and I sat down on the bed, and I started to lie down. And as I was lying down, I started to feel like I was losing consciousness. So I lean over to my wife, and I'm like, Olivia, you got to call 911 here. Something is really wrong. And so I explained what was going on. She's all confused. She calls 911, and the next thing you know, a couple of really horribly out of shape paramedics show up. Of course, feeling safe at that point, right? My elderly parents also come down the stairs. The whole thing is totally surreal. My mom's sitting there terrified. I end up getting loaded up in the ambulance. My mom takes a bad spill on the stairs as she's coming up because she's freaked out. And as a physician, of course, I am trying to figure out what the heck is going on, right? So I get loaded up in this ambulance, and I have no chest pain. My vital signs appear to be normal. I was maybe a little short of breath, but the biggest thing was I couldn't stand up. My body was tingling all over, and I had this horrible impending sense of doom. And for those of you who are physicians, this impending sense of doom is kind of something of a, when you hear patients say it, you got to take it seriously because it's usually bad. Anyway, I didn't know what was going on, but I knew, or at least I thought I knew, it couldn't be good. So as the ambulance, starts taking me to the University Medical Center, and they were taking me there in particular because they had a stroke center there, and they thought maybe I was having some kind of a brain event. Because the biggest thing was I was just mentally something was going on with me too. So I'm in this ambulance. I am absolutely terrified of losing consciousness because I literally am thinking if I fall asleep, if I lose consciousness, I'm never going to wake up again. So. I'm trying really hard to stay awake. I'm sitting there and I'm thinking about my wife and kids, and, the things that come into your mind at that moment, you're like, gosh, this is the last time I saw them. Is it the last time when they closed the door I ever saw outside? But the things that really started to freak me out were I'm starting to think, wait a second, did I set up my family well? Did I take care of them? Christian and Rod were finalizing a significant, larger Wealth Formula banking life insurance policy for me that was lacking just one little thing, my signature. I just put it off. I hadn't signed it. And it was like, it's not like it was sitting there for weeks, but it was a few days and I could have just signed it and sent in money, whatever. So I'm sitting there thinking to myself, I can't believe this. If I had just taken care of that a day earlier, my family, I wouldn't be worried about this at all. It was like a big, much bigger sum. And now I'm sitting there thinking about what I actually had from before, and will that be enough? It wasn't like I hadn't done anything, but it was clearly, in my mind, nowhere near what they should have. I also started wondering about, how my wife would ever know about all of these investments. I haven't done a very good job of keeping her in the loop on the basic stuff. And just imagine, in her case, she's got all this other, there's this crazy amounts of different private placements, et cetera, not to mention the crypto accounts. What a nightmare, I'm thinking to myself. And that's just the investing stuff, right? There's also this whole thing that goes in my head. What about, what is up here? I'm thinking, all that deferred gratitude, was it really worth it? Would it have really have hurt if I'd splurged on that vintage Ferrari that was on my bulletin board for the last 2 or 3 years? Or if I'd splurged a little bit less on the 1967 Lincoln convertible that I was looking at and then passed up at the last minute because I'm thinking I'll buy more Bitcoin. All those years of hard work coming down to these last few hours. That's what I was thinking. And all I could think about was how I didn't adequately take care of my wife and kids, at least up to the point where I would have liked to. And, with life insurance in particular, and frankly, the cars I didn't buy, right? The things, the toys, the things I wanted to do, etc. So I get to the hospital, they put me through a myriad of tests, right? And the good news is they seemed to rule out anything big and bad. And at that point, I still didn't feel well, but I started to think, well, maybe I pull through on this one after all. I'm thinking right now, maybe it's 50-50. When I'm in that ambulance, I'm thinking 90% chance, 80% chance this is it. Then after a few hours of tests, they didn't find anything. I got my head scanned. There was no bleeding or anything like that in there. They couldn't really figure anything out. So they gave me a bunch of fluid and I started to feel normal again. And as it turned out, the whole thing was a big false alarm because when we went back and looked through what had happened the entire evening, the only thing that was out of the ordinary was probably about 30 or 40 minutes before I got up. I took a medication which I'd never taken before. And as it turned out, it was like a bad reaction to that medication. So anyway, I started to feel normal. The fluid seemed to wash everything away. I spent the night at the hospital, but fortunately, the next morning, my 3 little girls popped into the room and we went home. I felt really, really grateful for being alive and seeing the little faces again. And for the next few days, I was on a bit of a high and really grateful for everything around me. And of course, as soon as I could, I signed those life insurance documents and made sure, and I vowed to make wealth formula banking an even more important aspect of my personal portfolio. Now, you have to ask yourself, and I don't know if you've done this, I certainly hadn't, what would you be thinking if you were convinced all of a sudden that you're going to die in a few hours? Listen, it can happen to anyone. It can happen to anyone, old or young. Tyler Jenks, older guy, but he was on my show a couple of times, even recently in the last month or so. Died suddenly a couple weeks ago. He was on Twitter posting videos just a day or two before it all happened. Totally normal post from Tyler about, Bitcoin and the markets, et cetera. The next thing you know, he's gone. There was no indication from those videos at all that there was anything wrong with him. And what about all those, mass shootings that keep happening? No one expects it. It just happens, right? It's just bad luck. Not everyone gets to, quote unquote, stress test their sudden death. And I found that I was lucky that I got to do that. And I was getting another chance to make sure that I didn't feel it again. And most of us never really think about mortality, despite the fact that it remains the only guarantee in life. You may think of it as a depressing topic, but I have to say that it's critical that we keep it in mind, probably to live a more full life than anything else. So anyway, I thought this whole experience was incredibly powerful, and I wanted to figure out how to, help others with it too, and maybe pass on some of the information that I feel like I got from this horrible experience, which I do not recommend. So I asked my friend, Dr. Colleen Crowley, to come on this week's Well Formula podcast, and she will give it to us straight after these messages. Welcome back to the show, everyone. Today, my guest on Well Formula podcast is Dr. Colleen Crowley. She's been a licensed therapist for 20 years. She's helped individuals with a wide variety of issues as a licensed therapist. And she's based in Santa Barbara here in a good friend of mine and of our families. And one of her niches is in the high-paid professional, high-net-worth entrepreneur area. She's been on the show before, and she was a big hit. And given my recent brush with mortality, I thought it would be a good, Colleen would be the perfect person to discuss this and how we can apply this potentially to our lives. So welcome back, Colleen. How are you?
I'm great, Buck. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here. I'm sorry it's under these circumstances where you
well,
were gonna die.
Well, we will, yeah, and we don't need to be totally serious about it. Obviously, I'm here. I'm not particularly. I just came back from the YMCA, actually, if you can tell. You know my YMCA stories, Colleen. I often end up in battle with octogenarian naked men in the sauna, and
Right.
it was one of those days where I escaped that battle.
No battles. That's a success. There's always tomorrow.
There's always tomorrow. So let's back up a little bit about you. You've been on before, but it's been a while, and we always have a bunch of new listeners. So, you obviously have been, a therapist and licensed therapist, helping a lot of people for a long time. But one of the things we talked about is you do have this, one of your niches is interesting, and that it's really with sort of highly successful professionals, entrepreneurs. Is that because you were in Santa Barbara, or how did that end up being one of your areas?
What's interesting is now midlife is a really rich time for self-examination.
Mm-hmm.
So I see a lot of people in that phase of life coming in to explore themselves, which is really exciting. So it's a fertile time for self-exploration and seeking out a therapist. I have talked to lots of corporations and CEOs and CFOs and heads of hospitals and guest lecturer there. And so then that turns into sort of them referring to their colleagues, their peers. And so while I treat a little bit of everything, and I've been practicing long enough to see a lot of it, there is that group that's sort of a prominent part of my practice, which I really enjoy.
Yeah. And, I think one of the nice things about having those kinds of niches is from the perspective of a patient, the more experience you have with a given cohort, the more you can sort of, add value. So I mean, that's great. And I think we've talked a lot about these kinds of midlife issues and things like that, sort of just as an interest of mine, because, I like to talk about holistic wealth sometimes too, not just about the money part. But so I want to focus kind of on what happened to me and sort of take this as a potential learning thing for all of us. So you heard about what happened, and it got me to think more and more about this topic of near-death experiences, how to react to them, et cetera. Of course, people, you've been around people who get sick earlier in life than expected. I think that we can learn a lot from these experiences. What are some of the takeaways from those kinds of patient experiences that you've witnessed, or maybe that are common themes?
Yeah, so I think you're right. I mean, whether it's a near-death experience similar to what you had, or a terminal illness, a diagnosis where all of a sudden there's a pretty radical shift in paradigm of how you sort of view life. As much as you're going to hate me saying this, is I love oftentimes when people come in following those experiences, because they're really experiencing a pretty profound shift in their consciousness and their reality. I often hear the same quote. I can't tell you how many times I've heard it, which is following either a near-death experience or a very scary diagnosis, is it's the best and the worst thing that's happened to me.
Yeah.
Right. Because it's
like an awakening, right? It's an awakening, because a lot of us, particularly in the, who are high achievers, especially those who are grinding it out, like say in the hospital 50 hours a week or whatever, there's very little time for self-reflection. And listen, I'm not even one of those guys who grinds it out necessarily, but I find myself all of a sudden like noticing that I've gotten older.
Absolutely. Well, this goes back to this topic, Buck, which is, a Buddhist quote, which is, the trouble is we think we have time.
Right.
And I think that that's what those experiences do, is it's a radical shift in the illusion that we have time. And what I deal with, whether it's a terminal diagnosis or a near-death experience, is what's interesting is in therapy, I'm sort of dealing with this concept of shifting your relationship to that illusion, right? To be more present, right? To be more fulfilled in a daily sort of existence and reality. Because what the human condition does is it creates this sort of reality of happiness is outside of this given moment. It's when I achieve this, when I reach this goal, when this happens, which so robs us of the moment at hand and our quality of life. So whether it's a near-death experience, or what I always say to people is it's rarely ever the issue. After 20 years of practicing as a therapist, people walk through my door with every issue under the sun, right? And it's rarely ever about the issue. It's always about our relationship to it. And so what you experienced was a little taste of that, was how you're relating to life and how that can profoundly shift how then, in fact, you begin to move through life differently.
Two of the main concerns, I had in that ambulance ride, one of them we don't need to really talk about because it's really mostly financial. And I think that's a show in and of itself, is how you make sure that you wrap things up and put a bow on them for any period of time, and I was talking about insurance and things like that. The other thing I think is an incredibly common theme, I would think, which is the disappointment that I didn't, really have enough fun, right? Like the ultimately what it comes down to. So there's this, and you could probably tell us that experiment, the experiment with highly successful, people as children, and they get tested and delayed gratification, and those who show delayed gratification tend to become higher achievers, right? I mean, do you want to tell that? Do you know that story offhand? I don't know what that's. There's a study.
Well, I'm familiar with what you're talking about. I'm curious about, because you're talking about when your experience was you're in that ambulance ride and you're thinking to yourself as an overachiever, right? Why didn't I buy the car in real time that would have provided me a little bit of joy? And I can't tell you how frequently I see that in those experiences, right? Which is, and yes, in a subset of the population that's really good at, working hard and putting their head down and deferring some gratification, right? And there you were realizing, man, I'm not so sure I should have done that, right? And I think that's what I see so much, right? Is this breaking down of today is all I have. This moment is all I have. And how to embody moving through the world in that way. And I think you're referring to the marshmallow test. Did you see that with kids?
That's right. That's what Will you remind us what that was? Because that's kind of what I'm getting at.
So, I mean, there's various ways of sort of, measuring this. They do it in children, and they painfully, I want to sort of as accurately as possible get it right. You can look it up. It's hilarious. But I think they leave kiddos alone in a room with a marshmallow, sometimes alone, sometimes with a friend possibly, and they tell them to not eat the marshmallow. And I can't remember
I think it's like if they don't eat the marshmallow, they get 2 marshmallows later, right?
Right. And so you see this like really in very young children sort of thoughtful sort of process and this negotiating of, oh man, if I have it now, what does that mean? Or can I wait?
Right.
You know, variation in what people do. You know, I like to think it's sort of a one slice of an examination of
Sure. No, I agree.
Decision. But you know, why in the heck don't you just eat the marshmallow? I think is sort of the metaphor here or the concept.
Well, I think that the net result of that, what I was getting at was that, and again, we're talking about this esoteric test, but the idea was what they measured was the kids who ultimately waited and for that, you know, delayed gratification, you know, fast forward 10, 20 years were more successful financially than the kids who did not express delayed gratification, the ones who went straight for the marshmallow.
Yes.
And so I think I think we're as a cohort of, you know, successful professionals, particularly, you know, doctors, engineers, et cetera, these sort of people who've been in school for a long time. We're those people who wanted the 2 marshmallows, right? And so we've shown ourselves as success. The real question in my mind goes back to the idea of those kids and saying, okay, well, the kids who waited for the extra marshmallows, they were more successful, but who was more happy? You know?
Exactly. And what's so interesting is I'm getting, you know, then I treat the kids who waited for the 2 marshmallows.
Right.
And this is where it gets really interesting is
Right.
they're coming in looking for so much of their life goals have been achieved, whether it's financial or professionally, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they're lacking a huge component of just joy or
Mm-hmm.
meaning, right? Or levity, right? And I think that that's, again, you know, what I see so much in people who've had this paradigm shift through a life-changing event similar to what you have, right? So, and is there, it's so important to examine that, like I said, because what I start to see is a lot of pretty intense levels of depression in this sort of midlife category. What is really exciting is, you know, 30 years ago, and you and I have talked about this, it used to be an affair and a Corvette or a Porsche, right? And now it's exciting to see people doing, you know, a little bit sort of more existential and consciousness raising to find meaning in a different way. And I also want to go back to, you sort of brushed by the first thing that you kept thinking about, which was, did you prepare your wife and your, you know, family for your ultimate demise? And that's also by and large the biggest thing I see is not so much the preparing, but what I think you were thinking about, Buck, was your relationships, right? And the people you love most, and are they okay?
Yeah.
Right. And that is without question, probably the biggest thing I see is meaning, right? What does my life mean? Is it what I have wanted to cultivate for myself? And also, how are my relationships? Who do I need to forgive? Who do I need to reach out to? Who should I have gotten rid of a long time ago?
Yeah. I think that almost, you know, what's interesting to me is that, like, I think there's probably a difference in terms of the types of things you think about when you're in an acute situation, like where you're literally, in my situation, it was not like, you know, chronic illness, blah, blah, blah. You know, I have lots of time to think about this stuff. But for me, it was like more like, okay, you know, this is funny, but I was talking to my brother. My brother's like 51, and you know, we were joking around about this afterwards. I mean, he thought I was, you know, something was going on too, and we were both worried. And I told him on the phone, I said, you know, I really thought I was toast. I mean, I thought it was history. And he's like, yeah, like, and he goes like Sanford and Son when when Mr. Sanford says, oh, this is the big one. And I'm like, yeah, listen, you and I are like old enough to know what the hell you're talking about.
Right. That's so funny, but it's true, right? I mean, it's as old
Right.
as Sanford and Sons, and you.
Right. But he said, but the bottom line is the issue is that like, it was like, okay, I thought 2 hours, I thought if I fell asleep, I wouldn't wake up. Like if I felt like if I let myself go, I wouldn't wake up. And so in that moment, very much I was like, my thing was, gosh, all right, the finances, all right, I'm thinking about my kids and family, but very practical standpoint. What did I do? Where are they going to be? And so that's probably different from necessarily if you had somebody said you had a year or something like that, or
Without question.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, for instance, yesterday I had a patient who has a diagnosis that's dramatically affecting his cognition, right? With sort of no cure and no real treatment. And so what he wants to be doing right now is conveying thoughts to his wife and his 2 sons and his 3 granddaughters, everything that he feels, because while he's young in his body and healthy, it's clear that he's going to be compromised going forward. And so he's doing this sort of systematic evaluation of conveying everything that he wants to, and he has more time, right? You didn't feel like you had that time in that ambulance. So I think you're right. It depends on where you are. Or how dire it feels. But the real question is how do you, and maybe you're going to get to this, is how do you embody that without a near-death experience, right? Or a terrifying diagnosis?
Yeah, and I think that is so. A couple things. When I told you about this, one of your questions for me was, well, how do you feel now? And this was, I think we talked like it was like 2 weeks after it happened or something. And I told you the first few days I was like super, I don't know. I felt enlightened, like I felt like everything was better. Everything was just, gratitude for everything. But then I think probably because of the acute nature of the whole thing, my brain just went back into the same old thing. And then, I was convinced I was going to go, that I was going to grab one of those cars. And I came home and I'm like, I don't know about that. The tax implications and all the, stuff came back immediately. And sadly, in my case, I think I kind of just regressed back. And so, part of it is trying to understand how do you bring that out in yourself to, because I, like I said before in the intro, the advantage I had is something that very few people get, which is to stress test your own imminent demise, right? Like if that happens and you truly believe it's happening, then you will get in tremendous clarity on your situation. How do you make that happen without the trauma?
Yeah, I mean, if only we could bottle what you felt, Buck, right? And
no one would buy it, Cole.
I mean, you were more conscious, right? You were more enlightened. You were more self-aware. You were more present in that ambulance, albeit terrifying sort of ride to the hospital. And that is, in fact, I mean, what we're all striving for, right? Is consciousness raising, right? Across the planet, individually. And you had it for a second. And even though it sort of has quickly, left you, I would argue that you still had a taste of it, which is extremely valuable. And look, enlightenment takes practice, right? So what I tell people is everyone wants to sort of come into therapy and feel better, right? Feeling better requires a practice and a dedication, right? And feeling better generally comes from being more embodied, right? Anxiety is caused by chronically living in the future, right? What if this happens? What if I don't do this? What if this happens? And depression is often sort of living in the past, right? Is why did things not go as planned? Why did I do that? Which again, robs you of the current moment. In that ambulance ride, you had a very sort of clear moment of being in the present. And the work is to get back to that as much as you possibly can. And that's a practice, right? Mm-hmm. So you can't sort of say, I want to be really good at tennis and then not practice tennis, right? You can't say, I want to be more mindful, right? Or more enlightened or more conscious and then not practice it. And so I think you have to sort of commit yourself to achieving what you felt in that ambulance ride. Because as you know, your neural pathways are well formed. And so we're trying to create new ones for you, but it's been easier for you to just go back to the familiar ones.
Yeah. And you know, there's two things. Obviously, one is you could practice by, you know, trying to recreate that situation. I don't know how you do that, but I mean, I think it's probably, at least from a financial perspective, it's a good exercise to put yourself in that situation and see, you know, how have you prepared everybody? Are you satisfied if today was your last day? It's a very wise thing to do, because I think when you look at all of these, you know, things that just happen, and you know, you interviewed a guy a couple times, even the last month I had him on, or a month or two, and he died suddenly, you know, Tyler Jenks. And then there was and then you look at these mass shootings that are happening, and things happen, right? And so there's an illusion, I think, for all of us, otherwise we would go crazy, that today or tomorrow is not the last day, and eventually it will be the last day. And so you have to make that kind of thing. Now, from the long-term perspective, psychologically, I'm guessing, and I know this for a fact, that you're a big advocate of meditation, and which I have to admit I am a huge advocate for, but it has been just terrifically difficult for me to figure out when to do it at this point. Talk about the benefits. Talk about, you know, it's the worst, you know, it's just completely ironic when you say, you know what, I'd love to meditate, but I just don't have the time.
Yeah, right. Yes, and to be clear, how I like to think of it is meditation is just the exercise to prepare and reinforce the practice of being mindful. Does that make sense? And all being mindful means is being in your body and in the present moment, which is the single most life-changing thing any of us can do to increase a sense of well-being, consciousness, and quality of life.
So explain how that works. You're not, I think what you're saying, you're differentiating from saying, okay, listen, it doesn't have to be a type of meditation, but it may be, in practical purpose, how do you practice that? Is that like, multiple times a day, you try to just stop for a moment and think, hey, I'm here and I see this, and this book is green, and I touch this book, and this is how it feels, and this food tastes the way it does. I mean, how do you do that?
Yeah, and see, just listening to you, I love it, Buck, because it's so cerebral. Right? The work is always to get sort of in your body and out of your head. And so to explain what I always say is meditation is just sort of teaching you how to get out of your head and into your body. And then, when you sit in the lotus position and say ohms, right? But then the work is to not get out of that 15-minute yoga class and go be totally unconscious through the rest of your life. It's to remember how it was, like you were in that ambulance, like you were possibly in the yoga class, of being in your body. So I've been practicing this with people for so long that I don't really meditate anymore, but what I do is encourage people to be vigilant about their breath, right? Because while I'm talking to you, Buck, I'm vigilant about being in my body and paying attention to my breath. And that in turn grounds me into the present moment and doesn't let me spin off into, did I do that? What do I have to do? What if that doesn't happen? What if my, kiddo this, that? Does that make sense? So
it does.
For someone like you, where I hear it so often, it's so hard. It's so hard to meditate. I'm like, you're attempting to do it in perhaps the wrong way. What I say is it should feel good. It should feel like you have less to do, right? It's just a process of slowing down and becoming embodied, which all ties into this concept that we're talking about of living in the present moment. Like there's not a tomorrow, right? And that radically shifts, like I said, one's well-being and quality of life. So go ahead.
You know, I think you can talk about like how it feels to be present and stuff. And I know what you're talking about, and you tell me if this is kind of the way you think of it too, but I always think about like when I was a kid, right? I wasn't really thinking about, when I was like 10 years old or 12 years old or 11 or whatever, I wasn't thinking about, where I was going to invest or how I was going to defer time. I was just thinking about playing, right? Yeah. Who's going to play, and who's up for a game of of hockey, and then while you're playing that game, to be just engrossed in that game, nothing else really matters, and that's a feeling that is very, very difficult for I think for some people as they get older and they become professionals and they're in this other world now to recreate. I get it when I watch football games now. I get that when I'm watching like football games and I can't fast forward it. If it's live, I get it. I get that kind of sensation then. But it'd be nice to be able to translate that to more of life.
Because what's going on for you in that moment where you're watching a football game and you're so engrossed?
I'm in the moment, right? Because I can't fast forward and I need to know what's happening next. And it's all a drama before my eyes that I can't I'm living it right at that minute. Right. And that
people can you think of one time in your life, right? Or when you most consistently feel that kind of feeling, right? A lot of times it's a physical activity.
Yep.
Because people can't afford to be sort of living in the past or in the future. They're right in the moment, and they, we live in California, right? Oh, it's when I'm surfing, right? Oh, it's, when I'm on a run on the cliffs or a hike, whatever that looks like. And it's because you're so radically in that moment. And I want to be clear because people, come back with well, how can you always live in the moment? I mean, you have to plan for your future. And I realize your podcast listeners are doers and achievers, but you can plan and goal set so long as you're conscious, right? We get disconnected and live in our heads and ignore our bodies, right? And so you can be really grounded while you're goal setting or achieving, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
It's not that goes away. It's just shifting how you move through the world, which is, as I said, I mean, where there's the biggest hope for a shift in well-being, and what people who have near-death experiences or a terminal illness have a really sort of intense dose of that shift consciously.
Right. What would you say, I mean, aside from, these relationships and delayed gratitude, like what are some of the other takeaways, just so that, people can maybe start to think about the things that, maybe they're not thinking about right now, but what are some of the other themes that come up with people who are in this situation or who are starting chronic illness or something like that?
So obviously health is one of the biggest, right?
Yeah.
So what I hear about so much is this, human body we were given. I didn't either appreciate it. I hear a lot about not appreciating it, right? And valuing it. I hear a lot about mistreating it, right? I didn't, treat it as well as I should have, appreciate it as well as I should have. I also want to encourage people that, your body is the biggest informant about your well-being, right? So dis-ease, right? That word comes from, your body being imbalanced. So to pay attention to what it's saying, if you have back pain, if there's tension in your shoulders, if you have chronic headaches, I mean, these are oftentimes things that bring people into my office. And the work is to try to figure out, what the psychological underpinnings of those are that are causing that. So health is a huge one. Meaning, right? There's been a lot of research on people are looking for happiness, but ultimately what sort of people report brings them the greatest quality of life is finding meaning. And so that's what I see a lot in these high-paid midlife individuals is, okay, I kind of did everything for parent approval or cultural approval, but now I'm finding myself sort of examining what I want life to look like and where I'm going to find value and meaning. Relationships are a huge one. Are they healthy? Have you said everything you want to say? Are there things you need to clear up? Are there things you need to initiate? And worry. I think worry is, I see people walk in after these events just saying like, I cannot believe the hours I have spent worrying about either what I did or what's going to happen, because it's such a waste of time.
Yeah.
Those are probably some of the biggest
Yeah.
ones.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so I am quite sure that there are people out there who are listening to this saying, gosh, these are some of the things I would love to talk to somebody about, but I have no idea who to turn, no idea, if there's somebody out there who's a professional who's used to people like me, and obviously you're one of them. So if they want to get in touch with you, how would they do that?
So I have a website. It's drcolleencrowley.com, and I think all my contacts on there. I just encourage everybody, enlightenment or consciousness raising is a really personal process.
Yeah.
I hesitate even telling people how to get mindful, because I think it's really individual. Just kind of get curious about it, right? Sort of pick up a book, look at a podcast, listen to a meditation app, and just sort of see how you can sort of begin to wake up to this process. Mm-hmm. The single biggest thing you can do is just keep getting in your body, right? Yep. Check in with your breath. And there's a lot of professionals out there as well that can help you.
Not as good as you, though.
No, come on. You're just biased because we're friends.
Okay, well, Colleen, listen, we're going to put the website, it'll be in the show notes, obviously, and please, I think, there's a lot of people out there I know who struggle with these issues. We just, it's not a sickness, it's like a guidance, right? At some point or another, it's good to have somebody to talk to, so Colleen would be a fantastic person to check out. So,
but, hey, Buck, before we wrap up, I'm going to ask you,
sure,
therapist, what do you intend to do to try to cultivate this feeling you experienced in the ambulance and integrate it more into your daily life?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question because, like I said, there's a few things that I've sort of. One is that I'm having trouble kind of getting back to, trying to bring the urgency back, but there's a couple things that are going on. I think one is like I am a little bit paranoid right now about like any little things that are going on, and I'm like, I gotta eat better, and I do this. I mean, even though none of what happened to me was related to an actual real health problem, it was like a reaction, right? But so now and then I'm a little paranoid whenever I feel like a little twingy or something like that. I'm like, what is that? What is that? Yeah. So I'm a little paranoid. Hopefully that'll go away. But then the other thing is, though, I mean, for me, I have been thinking a lot about, there is something lacking for me in terms of that. I used to be a surgeon, right? So I am a surgeon. And one of the times when I used to get that feeling of being present was when I was operating. So when I'd operate, you can't really be anywhere else. And I enjoyed it. And I was there in the minute. It was almost sort of like I hate to make it seem like this, but it was like a video game or something, right? I mean, I was doing, it was like
focus was heightened, and you
right, and time would fly by, and then I would finish when I'd finish like a case, and even back in residency, it would be like 7 or 8 or 9 hours or whatever. And doing this case, it would fly by, and then at the end, you'd get the sense of completion and satisfaction, And in what I do now, as much as I love the process of picking things apart and looking at them analytically, there is not a start and finish, and I think that creates a void for me of feeling like that sense of accomplishment. I don't know if that makes any sense.
100%, sure. I mean, it was a discrete beginning and end in surgery, right?
Yeah, it was and then I did something that was very clear for that day, right? It was very clear for that day. It had a beginning and ending. It was a problem. I fixed the problem.
Right.
That kind of thing.
Box, right?
Yeah. And I don't want to practice because of a lot of other baggage that goes along with being a surgeon, but trying to find something to replace that void is probably something that I'd like to do. And I just haven't figured out what that is yet.
Yeah. And I mean, to really sort of push you on this, I mean, the fantasy is that you begin to move through life like you're always in surgery, right?
Yeah.
Like that feeling of being that radically present all the time.
Right.
That's the challenge, right? Because again, you're still sort of looking for an activity to allow you to be present. Do you see? As opposed to like, oh, wait, I'm present right now.
Yeah, and I think the activity though is a tool to sharpen that. And I think because what it is I think it's very, like for some people who are meditating and they can get into that state. I think the state for me, if I'm doing something like that, it continues, it has a lasting thing.
Right. Yep. Yeah. And I think you have this, sort of challenge of cultivating that in the absence of having that, which is a good thing to strive for.
Yeah. And then, like with sports and stuff, I was a big athlete and that's something else too. But I've also got all sorts like orthopedic, like my back is a constant, it's like a constant challenge, You know
what you should do, Buck, is just watch football games 24/7. Right? It sounds like that's effective.
You know what I've been doing that I think it's totally random, but I have it seems to do something for me. Is like I've suddenly started reading books about like old athletes that I used to, or of sports or whatever that I used to watch when I was a kid, and it totally gets me absorbed.
Yeah, isn't that interesting though? So I mean, again, just like stringing together as many of those experiences for you as possible.
Yeah.
It's a good one. All right. Well, I'm going to keep checking in on you.
Yeah. Listen, at the end of the day, luckily this for us is, these are first world problems and, but they are problems that we have. And
I would also say though, that sort of cultivating consciousness is a global thing, right? So while we're lucky to negotiate and wrestle with enlightenment and not, if we're going to have food on our table,
right?
I think there's a collective effect when we can all sort of raise our self-awareness. So
yep, absolutely.
And stay out of trouble at the YMCA.
I will. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the show, everyone. Hopefully that was thought-provoking more than it was depressing. I think it's really important stuff. And I do encourage you to, do some kind of an exercise where you just, at some point decide that, you're just going to have for a minute say, okay, what would happen if I was gone? Like what would happen? What things did I not take care of? Obviously there's a financial aspect of that, making sure your kids are okay, et cetera. But there's also like, is there deferred, gratification things that you've just deferred too long, right? If you're in your 50s or whatever and you're still deferring, maybe it's time to stop deferring and, do some of these things that you wanted to do or buy some of these things you want to buy, right? The other thing I want to do is I do want to emphasize on a purely practical perspective that when I thought it was all coming to an end, the only thing I could think about were two things, really. I mean, they were my wife and kids and the things that I didn't do in my life, right? I mean, those are really what they come down to. Now, in terms of the wife and kids part, we talked about this conversation on recent Wealth Formula Network call, which, by the way, I think a lot of you would enjoy. And if you go to wealthformularoadmap.com, you can find out more about that. But anyway, we talked about this issue, which is the importance of, these products like wealth formula banking or other kinds of, life insurance investments. Now, these are incredibly powerful. And especially given the, situation I was in, they're not only powerful in terms of investing for yourself, but you're also taking care of perhaps the only thing that really matters to many of us, which is, of course, our families. I mean, the beauty of this kind of product is that you can really screw everything up, right? You can time the markets wrong. You can, invest in the wrong things. But if you have this, your family's not going to pay for your screw ups. In reality, too, if you think about it, one of my biggest takeaways from this experience, and here's something for you to think about. If you overfund a banking policy for 2.5, 3 years, right, without even taking a loan out of there, which we talk about all the time, right, and double dipping, but say 2.5, 3 years you don't take a loan, you guarantee, because of the premiums will get paid for automatically from these things at that point, you guarantee your family gets paid when you die, even if that's not at a young age, even if it's you're older, it just doesn't expire. This is an asset that goes on, to the end of your life. And that's really powerful when you strip away things to really what matters, like I kind of did in that ambulance ride. And what mattered to me at that point was insurance and, taking care of my family and thinking, well, gosh, there was things I would have liked to have done or, maybe enjoyed, which I didn't do. So anyway, hopefully you enjoyed the show. That's it for me this week on Wealth Formula Podcast. This is Buck Joffrey signing off.
Thank you for listening to the Wealth Formula Podcast. Visit us on the web at wealthformula.com. The information contained in this podcast are opinions, not fact. As always, consult your own financial team before making any investment. See you next time.